Dr. D. Jaffe, welcome to the show, my man. How you doing?
I'm great, Max. How you doing, man?
It's great to see you.
Really good to see you. Thanks
We're friends offline, and super excited to have you in to celebrate your first book, right?
It's my second book.
Oh, it's your second book.
But the first by, a real big publisher. So published by Hachette, which is really nice.
Well, mazel tov, my friend.
Thank you. It's been an endeavor, because there's like a shelf of books over here of yours. So that's awesome.
It is a big deal. I remember when my first book came out, and it felt like you spend your entire life like writing essentially your first book, and it's just the weight that it feels like coming off your shoulders is just unbelievable.
Yeah, and I think it's funny as a little parallel to some of the other stuff we're going to talk about today. I think people who have never written a book think you sit down and you just kind of write a book, and for me at least, it was months spent thinking about the outline, like what is the book going to cover throughout the whole thing, and then writing it in little snippets, and then looking at, this is probably draft 20 or 25 or something. So a ton of patience, a ton of dedication, and way more time. I'm really impatient. I don't know about you, but I'm really impatient. So it took way more time than I wanted it to, but I'm really happy with it now.
Yeah, it's well worth it. Because now you've got this tome that's like going to be invaluable to so many people. So let's get into it.
Yeah, please.
How do we free ourselves from addiction forever? It's like such a compelling subtitle. I know a lot of people struggle with addiction, whether it's to ultra-processed junk foods, to sugar, to porn, to alcohol, social media.
Yeah.
Let's start there.
Sure. First of all, I love that you included all those right off the bat, because I think a lot of people, when they think addiction, they think alcohol and drugs. And especially in today's world, I would say that's a substantial portion of what people are addicted to. But between technology, which then parlays into porn or gambling, right? A ton of online porn and gambling addictions. The porn industry is one of the biggest industries in the universe. And it's because people are literally addicted to it, right? Spending hours, thousands, if not millions. There was that woman on OnlyFans that said she made like $46 million last year.
Oh yeah.
1 million from a single individual. Now just imagine, I don't care how much money you have, spending $1 million on an OnlyFans girl is its own little addiction. Yeah. So food, sugar is one of the first drugs that we ever got, right? Concentrated sugar. It's not that different if you think about it than, you take cocaine from coca leaves and you concentrate it and chemically alter it, and now it becomes a really concentrated drug. So I think the question you asked was, how do we get over addiction? And there's a quote I use in the book. I use it with also on my clients. Anybody can get over their addiction to anything. You just have to become somebody who's not addicted. What do I mean by that? We are the sum of our habits, our physical environment, the people we spend time with, our internal beliefs. If you're willing to shift all of those, you can easily kick any addiction. And the main point that I make in the book, the reason it's called Unhooked, is when people talk about their addiction, they normally say, I'm hooked on cocaine, or I'm hooked on this TV show, or I'm hooked on porn. And the point that I make in the book is that's not what you're really hooked on. What happens to a lot of us who struggle with addiction, and I have myself, is we're hooked on other things. Self-loathing, perfectionism, anxiety. Social anxiety was a huge one for me. We're hooked on those things, and they cause us pain and discomfort. The thing we say we're addicted to is actually just the pain relief from the hooks. So I kind of create this visual in the book. Like, imagine there's a hook in here of social anxiety, and every time you hang out with other people, you start thinking badly of yourself. There's negative self-talk. You want to isolate. You want to get small. Well, you drink, and the literal pain from the hook that's hooked into you subsides, and now you can be normal, quote unquote. So unhooking is literally about removing all of those driving mechanisms that get the addiction going.
Wow. And does every quote unquote addiction, is there a is there a hook that you can trace each one back to? Like, would you say, like, what would porn be, like an addiction to porn?
Yeah.
What might elicit that?
So there's not one. So I don't think there's a one-to-one connection. I actually make a point in the book that I don't think addiction is a disease or a disorder. It's a syndrome. If you know the different, like, syndromes are essentially a collection of symptoms that show up together. They can be caused by completely different things, right? So you may have carpal tunnel syndrome. You may have it from sitting at your desk and typing, or from working in a cash register, or you may just get it because something else you do regularly puts too much tension on certain areas of your wrist, right? The underlying cause could be different. So you asked a question about porn. There's actually a story about a porn addict in the book, and his story goes like this. His dad left early, raised by mom and a sister, and he was always really, really isolated, always grew up around women, never had a male role model, never really felt comfortable with that electrical charge, kind of sexual energy that he felt towards women, because he knew them as nurturers, but he never really understood. He never had a man to guide him in a way, right? About what does this mean? Like, I'm getting turned on. What is all this? And then he got exposed to porn at a relatively early age. I don't know when you first saw it. I was 11. He was like 11 or 12. And immediately it short-circuited his need for attention and for sexual energy without ever having to learn how to talk to women. And so then it grew very gradually for him. What happened was he started looking at it just to get himself off, and it was a physical piece. But then really for the rest of his life, when he was in a deep relationship with somebody, if something went wrong, if the intimacy wasn't great, if the sex wasn't good, instead of starting a conversation and having a relational solution for it, he went to porn. He never needed to fix intimacy issues because he always had porn. Porn always delivered. Fast forward 15, 20 years, he's married, he and his wife are having issues, and he went full in on porn. Essentially, they were just done having sex. They just weren't even having sex at all, and he didn't, quote unquote, need it because he had porn on the side.
Wow. Yeah, so many people today struggle with that, I feel like. We've had do you know Dr. Warren Farrell? Does that name ring a bell to you? He well, you reminded me of his work, which has been to kind of elucidate the consequences of being dad deprived.
Ooh.
And it sounds like this guy, you know,
Huge.
yeah, like not having that father figure around.
Yeah, and I'll just pair that with something else you said. To see a lot of men struggle with it. I'm 48 years old now, right? When I was a kid, porn meant magazines and it meant videotapes. Like, you had to go take a videotape. This may be really crazy for some of the people listening right now if you've never even heard of these things. I'm joking, but you had to go get this VHS tape, which, by the way, I had to find in my dad's collection because I couldn't get my own, right? And then you got to go put in a VCR. It made noise. It was uncomfortable. It was all we knew. I mean, now I could grab my phone and I could have access to the most massive library of porn in 5 seconds. Ease of access. We talk about this in Addiction, right? When in the book, the easier it is to access, the easier it is to use as a shortcut for the real work. The real work is intimacy. What are we looking for in sex? We're looking for connection. We're looking to be fed. The nutrition is in the connection that we have with others. And there's a chemical component to that, right? From endorphins to oxytocin, all that kind of stuff. But there's also just a relational component. We're social animals. We've always been social animals. Porn is like a shortcut. It makes you kind of believe that you're almost getting what you really want, which is what I think a lot of drugs do for us.
Yeah. There's this concept that I've been talking about a bit called, or what I refer to as the difference between earned dopamine and unearned dopamine.
I love that.
And I guess like unearned dopamine would be, the quick hits that you get from whether it's alcohol or porn or sugar, ultra processed foods, that give you that sense of reward without you having to have earned it, which I think is probably the more we've probably evolved these dopamine reward pathways to incentivize us to do things that would have been good for survival, would have been important for survival, for procreation, for safety. And now we basically, we tend to short circuit those same pathways, version 1.0 as they are, with these like really quick hits of unearned dopamine, whereas earned dopamine would be like, setting goals for yourself and then meeting those goals over time, whether it's like spotting the girl at the gym, working up the courage to ask her out on a date, going on the date with her, consummating the relationship. Yeah. And now we just default to things like porn.
Yeah. So I actually did my PhD, my final project, my dissertation. It was an animal study on the way nicotine and cocaine affect dopamine. So dopamine is it's like your novelty plus reward chemical. What do I mean by that? If you're walking around the world, you don't know what to expect, and you see something that is new and exciting, you get a dopamine hit. That's number one. Then if you do understand the lay of the land and you're expecting a reward, when you get the reward, you get a hit. But then gradually, as that reward becomes more and more expected, like most people know Pavlov's dog, right? So Pavlov's dog at first got the dopamine hit from the food. Eventually, they got the dopamine hit from the bell. The food no longer delivered dopamine because by the time the food got there, the bell had already fully predicted it. So it's more an unexpected reward. Does that all make sense? Now, if you think about the old world, I'm talking like hundreds of years ago, maybe even a couple of thousands of years ago, right? You would walk around the world and you would have these potential risks and potential rewards coming around. Dopamine was like the signal. Hey, go in that direction. That seems good. Oh, go in that direction. That seems bad, right? Lack of dopamine. Nowadays, I mean, my phone is in my pocket. It's like if I let my phone vibrate and ring, all day there's these little hits of potential rewards. And I think you said this, unearned versus earned. And then the second piece is the level of effort. Because even the earn, it's so sad to say, I'm like thinking of WALL-E, right? Like the movie WALL-E. It's like we're moving into a place where we want it to take the least amount of effort. That seems like the goal is to get to a state where we don't have to work hard and we get all the rewards. And I think what everybody misses, and that's why I make that quote, anybody can beat their addiction to anything as long as you're willing to become somebody who's not addicted. Those of us who find a way either out of addiction or the people who never found their way into addiction understand that to get the good stuff, you got to work. And oftentimes you got to work hard, right? You have a bunch of books you've written. It probably gets easier with time, right? This is my second book. It was easier than the first book. The seventh book is probably easier, but it's not nothing. It's not no work. And then you still have to go promote it and do that, right? I've known my wife for 20 years. We've been married 15. The relationship is still work. Like there's still stuff you have to do to make it a good relationship. And I think that's where the earned dopamine is best, when you've invested enough in it.
So how do we then unravel our addictions, whatever those addictions happen to be, and then set foot on that path towards resolving them?
Yeah. So the number one thing that I try to get everybody to understand is that just because it seems as if it goes one way, and I'll explain what I mean here in a second, that doesn't actually mean that you fully understand the journey of how you got to this place, right? And so I really in the book, I make people map out, there are a lot of exercises in the end throughout the book. I make people map out how they got to this moment. There's this little drawing that I use in there, Oftentimes we look at a person in their endpoint where we meet them and some of their behavior doesn't make sense. And there's something called the fundamental attribution error. I don't know if you ever learned about it. The fundamental attribution error is that when we see other people, we assume they do what they do because of who they are. It's their personality. When I do things, I understand all the context and the circumstance and the environmental factors that brought me to this point. The quickest example, I don't know if I can swear on this podcast or not, but the quickest example is, you're driving in your car and you're in a rush. Like let's say your girlfriend or your mom is in the hospital and you just found out. So you're all the way down on the gas. You're trying to cut in between the cars. You're getting through yellow lights, maybe even, driving through red lights. You're trying to get to the hospital as fast as you can. You're just in a hurry. But if you're having a leisurely day, you're sitting around, you're listening to, I don't know, whatever your favorite band is on the radio, and you're just kind of hanging out, and then somebody cuts you off and they're in and out of traffic, they're an asshole.
Yeah.
That's the word. What an asshole. You don't know what the circumstances are. They could have somebody in the hospital. They could do the exact same thing you would have done in the situation. The attribution is to their personality because you don't know them.
They might have to poop.
They may really have to go to the bathroom.
Yeah.
So what I try to get people to understand is sometimes we even do that to ourselves, but we certainly do it to other people. If I see you drinking a lot at a party and acting like a fool, I make it about who you are. You're an alcoholic or you have a drinking problem. I don't know everything that brought you to this point. So I help people really analyze what brought them to this point. And I have two models that I use. I kind of took the CBT model, cognitive behavioral therapy model, which is something happens in the world, you have beliefs about it, so you act. And the behaviorist model that was older, 50s and 60s, which is you act, you get a reward, and if you got a reward, you'll do it again. If you don't get a reward, you don't do it again. And then I combine it with trauma, and I call it the sparrow behavioral loop. So that's stimulus. I can show you a little drawing for it, but stimulus, perception, activation makes you choose a response that delivers an outcome. And what I try to explain to people is the thing that makes you want to drink is not the trigger that happened in the world, but it's the perception and then the feelings that trigger evokes. So like I said before with the hooks, you drive by an ex-girlfriend's house and it reminds you of the relationship and the loss, and it triggers your isolation, fear of being alone hook, and all of a sudden you're really anxious or maybe you're depressed. Well, how do I deal with depression? Maybe I go look at porn, or maybe I have a few drinks at a bar, and you just kind of automatically feel like you drive over to the bar, sit down and order 3 drinks. It feels like passing by your girlfriend's house is what made you want to drink. But what it is the fear of abandonment and fear of being alone. So we have to get at those. And that's how I get people unhooked, is I get them to understand those fears and then do the real deep work, the earned dopamine, if you will, of relieving the actual hooks.
And is understanding those hooks enough, or how do we resolve them?
Yeah, really, really great question. It's not. The short answer is understanding is not. So I actually have a whole section in the book that I say, understanding things makes you feel less afraid of them, which is a good starting point. I don't know, have you ever had anybody who struggled with addiction in your life?
In my life, in high school, yeah. One of my best friends in high school, I think in many ways ruined his life by due to an addiction to pot, to weed.
Yeah. Which I love that you used that, because a lot of people say you can't get addicted to weed. I'm like, trust me, I've seen hundreds of people fully addicted to THC because, again, it's not about the substance. It's about what role it plays for you, right? So the thing about understanding it is, even the people, this sounds really crazy to a lot of people when I talk to them, but just like people around those who are addicted can't understand the behavior, most of us, when we're in the middle of our addiction, we can't explain it to you. It feels like an inner drive, right, that shuts everything else off. Until you understand it, you feel hopeless. A lot of people with addiction issues have tried to resolve it dozens of times, if not more, hundreds of times, right? They've said God knows how many times, I'm going to quit. I'm done tomorrow. Today's my last day. I'm going to stop on New Year's, right? All that stuff, we've done it thousands of times maybe. It just hasn't worked. So that fear of hopelessness comes because you're afraid you can't. So the understanding just helps you understand where this came from, why is it happening, can I get to a different state? At least a belief that there's a possibility. What you put out is that enough? And it's not enough, because the next step is a lot of practice. And what I think is really hard for people to understand on both sides of the fence, I argue that everybody I know is either somebody who has struggled with addiction or is currently struggling, or has known somebody. I've never met anybody who literally doesn't know someone to whom this has happened. And if you see somebody, you really can't understand it if you've never struggled yourself. But because you're in it, struggling yourself, once you resolve the explanation, the underlying reason, the next hard thing that comes up is you've essentially relied on, I love your term, I'm going to steal it for this podcast. You've relied on unearned dopamine to relieve the pain from your hooks for so long. Average length from when you started struggling to when people get help is 15 years, right? That's like 5,000 days. For 5,000 days, you've struggled. And now you have to practice a new way of doing something. And what I explain to people is, of course you're not good at it. You can't be good at something that you're trying for the first time after 5,000 days of doing it another way. It's okay. You have to practice. And I use something called growth mindset. I'm sure if you've ever heard Carol Dweck's work around growth mindset.
No.
Really, really cool. We'll talk about it later. But I take tools from business. I take tools from social psychology, from habit, neuroscience. And I say, look, forget the shame and embarrassment about your addiction. Let's learn how to act differently.
So what is so if you can remind us again, what is the Sparrow method, and what is that meant to, like, what role is that meant to play in all this?
So the way I look at it is, from when you got triggered to the outcome. You blacked out at a party, you said something horrible, you left an argument with your partner or your significant other and went and used porn for 4 hours and kind of blocked it out and had another one of those experiences. A lot of men feel a lot of shame after that. You went back to use whatever the thing is, right? The outcome happened. Somewhere between those, you've got the perception, the activation, and the process of how you select responses. So there's 3 intervention points where you can now go in and practice new habits.
Wow. What are the intervention points? The perception,
Yep,
the activation,
and the response
and
selection.
the response. Wow.
So let's just do perception for a second, because I know your story. We've talked about it a good bit, and from the work on health and wellness and food to the movie, like all these things that you've done. Is it safe to say that your belief about the food that you consume and what it means for your body and your health, has that changed over the last 15 years in your life?
Yes.
Do you remember one or a few events at the onset of the switch, right, the pivot? Do you remember a few events that caused you to change your belief?
I think, probably just like doing an inventory of my own beliefs about nutrition and tracing back to try to understand where those beliefs had come from.
Okay.
Intertwined with, you know, at the phase of life where I was probably, you know, at my mom's house, maybe back when my mom was still alive, and looking around the kitchen at some of the things that were, you know, that were around in the kitchen that I had formerly, I guess, perceived as being healthful. You know, maybe it was like the big jug of corn oil by the stove with the big Heart Healthy logo on it, or the, you know, all the grain products that my mom had in the kitchen that I grew up eating myself. And just kind of doing like a reassessment of those things, because eating is like, we do it 3 times a day, if not more, and it kind of shocked me that I didn't have a deeper understanding about this thing that we all do, this activity that we all do.
So your mom got sick, and that's what made you look at it. Mm-hmm. What made you know that that's even something to look at?
I guess I always had this innate belief that food is really important, not just from the standpoint of how we look, but also how we feel. And but then when my mom became sick, it made the connection for me between what we eat, how we feel, and like our long-term health, like, you know, how long we've got like in these bodies.
Love it. So I use a really cheesy example in the book, and a lot of people believe in like Santa Claus when they were kids, and then something happened that made them not believe in Santa Claus. You knew food was important, but you had a very different perspective on how it was important than you do now.
Yeah.
That shift, it's a perspective shift. Your perception of food, what food is good, what food is not good, what good food means, how it implicates the rest of your existence, your well-being, your longevity, right? That connection got made. And if you'll know what I say when I say this, the moment you saw it differently, you couldn't see back the way you saw before.
Yeah.
It was like, I use it, you know, the Wizard of Oz, right? You look behind the curtain and you can't unsee anymore. Now, let's be fair. I'm 48 years old, as I said now, like that's happened to me a handful of times in my life. I don't even know right now that tomorrow I'm not going to have another one of those moments. So everything that I'm about to say here is with the caveat of, given everything that I know right now, what I explain to people is the way you see the world right now is not the right way to see it. It's just what you've been taught, right? That's your perception.
Yeah.
Well, that perception is not serving you, because that perception right now says, hey, I drove by my girlfriend's house. I'm going to be alone for the rest of my life because she broke up with me and nobody wants me. That's a perspective. Well, that perspective makes you feel shitty. It makes you feel anxious, depressed, etc. It makes you want to go fix yourself by going having a bunch of drinks or doing a line of blow or whatever, you know, watching 4 hours of porn. If I can help you change your perspective, so let's say you pass by your ex-girlfriend's house and you say, oh, I'm really happy that breakup happened because we were not a good fit for each other. I really loved her and she loved me, but we were, I don't know, trauma bonded, and for the rest of our lives we were going to be miserable together. I'm glad I had the relationship, but I'm actually really, really glad that it ended. The activation goes away. Now you're not anxious, you're not depressed. You don't need to go get a drink because the feeling doesn't come up. So that's one intervention point. Now, all of us have perspectives that allow us to interpret the world, but we interpret it through this old set of filters. And they're just handed down. But the thing is, I don't know what kind of house you grew up in. In my house growing up, nobody said to me, my mom and dad didn't say, hey, just so you know, this is how we look at the world. You may choose to look at the world differently later. That's not how the lesson got handed. The lesson was, this is how the world works. And so it was truth versus lie, right? Good versus bad, right versus wrong. Me in high school and college, I hated the world. Man, I was like the all black, 9 Inch Nails, you know, music in my ears, don't talk to me kind of guy. I woke up in the world already pessimistic. Like every day when I woke up, I felt like shit. And I had to fight that because in that viewpoint, with that perspective on the world, everything looked bad. So why not do a bunch of drugs to make it go away, right? And that's what I started at the age of 14. We moved from Israel when I was 14. We moved right into high school. High school was the most awkward time of my life. I spoke the language not really well, so I actually tell people, like, I sat in the foreign kid table in high school, which most people don't even know exists, but all the foreigners know. It's like the table where all the outcasts sit. Didn't feel like I belonged. Again, very awkward with girls because I couldn't really talk. Anyway, it was bad. And so I got introduced to some guys who like to smoke weed, and drink alcohol, and it was the best solution because when I drank and smoked weed with them, I was part of. And now my social anxiety went down. I felt comfortable. And that continued escalating. And my drug use just kept getting worse and worse and worse. And the drugs kept getting heavier and heavier.
Were you an addict?
I don't like the term. I was addicted.
You were addicted.
I was addicted to meth. So for the last 7 years, so I was addicted to pain relief from all those anxieties and everything that I felt. But the last 7 years, I was using a lot of meth all day, every day. I'm 165 pounds sitting here in front of you right now. I was 124.
Whoa.
I was 40 pounds. I mean, I was like skin and bones. It's kind of crazy.
Damn. Where'd you grow up?
I grew up in Israel, but then moved to Chicago, northern suburbs of Chicago, like Skokie, Illinois. I don't know if anybody knows where that is. And then upstate New York, Rochester, Buffalo. And then we came out for a visit during winter break from Buffalo, where it was, 4 degrees and snowing like it is right now. And it was what it is. Well, it wasn't 80 degrees. It's 80 degrees in December right now. That's kind of crazy. But it was 60 degrees, and everybody was walking around in sweatshirts and sweatpants. They thought it was cold. I was like, I'm moving to LA.
Whoa. But how'd you even encounter meth back then and at that age?
So
There's got to be a crazy story in there.
yeah, I mean, it's funny. Don't you feel sometimes like all the stories you go through are not crazy to you because you experience them? So it's only in retrospect that you can understand that. I was at UCLA. A girlfriend introduced me to Molly called ecstasy back then. So we did ecstasy together. We did that. Then some people introduced Coke. I've never really been a Coke fan, but we started doing a lot of ecstasy. And the entrepreneurial part of me realized that if I collect people's money and then buy it, I can have my drugs for free. So I did that. Then people started buying Molly from me. And then once they did that, a lot of friends would start requesting other drugs. So ketamine, GHB, LSD, mushrooms. I just started selling anything that people wanted. Meth was one of the last ones, actually. And it got introduced to me during finals. Anybody who's gone to college and remembers what finals time is like in college, it's like 2 weeks of just grinding. And I have ADHD. That's why I put this thing out here. 5 things I need to remember. So I was really behind on studying. And this friend gave me some meth. They were like, hey, if you need to study, do some of this. I was up for 72 hours straight studying for an accounting exam. And I'd never been in the class, and I got a B.
Wow.
On the final. I was like, all right, this crap works. So then I started doing it for every finals period, and it gradually became a daily thing.
Damn.
Yeah.
Yeah, my only exposure to that is through watching Breaking Bad. And that is that's a hell of a drug. Ruins lives. You cease taking care of yourself.
My life, the book opens with a SWAT team arrest in my apartment in Brentwood at 8 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday. And everything about my life literally looked like Breaking Bad up until, I don't know, a couple of months after that arrest.
Damn.
Yeah, it was insane.
Nice Jewish boy like you?
I know. My dad was a doctor. My mom was like an HR manager in a bank. It was crazy. But that's, by the way, That's why, I was listening to the Simon Sinek episode, and obviously like Simon's stuff in terms of mission and passion. In a weird way, it was because I went through all that crap myself. I was 26, 27. I spent a year in jail in LA County. When I got out is why I ended up being so passionate about like, what the hell happened? I was like this good kid from the suburbs, and I ended up selling drugs, gun in my waist, sawed-off shotgun under the seat in my Suburban. Like, there was an actual liquor navigator, actually, not a Suburban. But yeah, it was a weird 6-7 years.
Damn.
Yeah.
So how'd you break out of that? I mean, like, what did it take, an intervention?
The intervention was the SWAT team. That was my intervention. I mean, literally 12 cops, all black, guns, shotguns to my head. I actually had a gun like literally right here, hands reach out. And I thank God every day that I didn't have an impulse to even reach towards it, because I would not be here sitting talking to you right now. But yeah, that was the first intervention, was like a sign from God. I'd actually been in a motorcycle accident about 2 months before that arrest. Broke my leg. That's how the whole thing started. They found a half a pound of coke or a quarter pound of coke on me in my jacket. And so they knew I sold drugs, and they kept trying to get me to snitch every couple of days. Like, there was a period where I couldn't drive through Beverly Hills. I would just get pulled over, taken to the side, questioned, searched. And so for 3 months, I wouldn't give them names. And so they came with the SWAT team. And my lawyer literally just said to me, again, I was 124 pounds. And he said, look, if you don't get help, and if we don't get you clean from drugs, you're going to prison for a really long time, like 15 years. And so that was all. That was the intervention. The intervention was, I was like, show me the rehab. Let's do this. And it wasn't easy, but I just had to learn. Number one, I had to learn a lot of humility, and I had to learn to do the things that people told me to do, whether I believed in them or not, which was really hard for somebody like me initially. And then, you know, I talk about it in the book a little bit, but I got out of jail. I had 9 felonies. I couldn't get hired. I mean, I couldn't even get a pizza delivery job. Nobody wanted to hire me. So I went back to school, and that was really the transformation moment for me. Was I used to be a horrible student, but now I was back in school. It was like school or nothing. I didn't know how to do anything except for sell drugs. And I had the right advisor. Actually, was just texting with my advisor, Dennis Fisher from Cal State Long Beach, just 2 days ago. And he showed me the ropes, and I learned how to, I don't know, be a functioning member of society. But that's what I mean, right? Like, you knew your friend who was addicted to weed. When your hooks, when the things that bother you are taken care of by a drug or by a behavior, by pizza, whatever, ice cream, you stop developing the skills that a normal human being has to develop to just deal with life. You know, life is not, for anybody, life is not easy. It's not simple. It has ups, it has downs. And when you have this little hack, unearned dopamine, you don't learn how to earn dopamine. And it took me probably 3 years to learn how to be a functioning member of society. And then as soon as that happened for me, I just wanted to start teaching other people how to do it.
Wow. What was that transition like into like academia, back into real life after coming out of prison, after prison?
Jail. So the judge purposely didn't give me a prison sentence because that's a whole other system that you can get caught up in. He gave me a year, but then it's called a suspended sentence. He hung 7 years over my head. And he was like, look, if you screw this up, whatever you get next time, you got 7 years added to it, which was a very good motivator to not screw up. I'll tell you the shorthand thing, maybe a really quick example. It's not in the book, but I can talk about how different it was. So when I sold drugs, I joke, last year was the first year. I'm now 48. I was 27 when I went out of jail. When I got out of jail. Last year was the first year I made more money legally than I did when I was selling drugs.
Wow.
So at 27 years old, I mean, I made a good amount of money. I could do anything I wanted. I had 5 guys selling for me. You know, we'd meet every night. We'd kind of count up our money and then just party all night and then go do it again. And again, a lot of that sounds like fun. There were also many shitty aspects. Like, you can't trust anybody. Nobody wants you for anything except your money and your drugs. You're always at risk of getting arrested or robbed. I got robbed once and at gunpoint once. Like, I mean, there's also a lot of shitty aspects to it. But that was the life before. I go to jail, I get out, and I had to go back to school, and there were some classes I had to make up. And it's funny to say, like, I don't know if anybody else can even relate to what I'm about to say here right now, but going from having 5 guys selling for you and being able to do anything you wanted on any day, pull cash out of your pocket and just go do it, to do homework for some teacher in statistics at Cal State Long Beach and like have to just sit in class and just be a student was really hard. Literally just that, like the simple skill that I think a lot of other people learn. I had to learn how to do that. The thing is, I was really motivated. And that's why, to me, you know, the why thing with Simon, I think that's why that connects for me so much, is at no other point was my motivation to change high enough to do all the really hard work that it took. But that was the first year. Second year, I was still in my master's program. I was a 4.0 student. I came to every office hours. I did every project. I mean, I worked as hard as I could in school, and that opened the door for UCLA, which was the #1 school for a psychology PhD at the time. I don't know if it still is, but I had to grind, man. It was a grind for like 5 straight years.
And how do you pick psychology?
That was my bachelor's. So first of all, there was a good chance that I would know what the hell's going on in the class, because I was a shitty student, man. I was a really bad student before. And then the other piece, and I don't think I knew, you know, I don't know if you believe in serendipity. I call it, now it's like, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual at this point. I call it synchronicity. It's like these things happen on a daily basis for us, and there's this opportunity to connect. I don't think it happened by mistake, that's what I ended up picking, because it's what I ended up doing. But there was no forward thinking in terms of what am I going to do later. The only forward thinking was my dad was a doctor. He always wanted me to be a doctor. But we sat and we had a real conversation, like, you know, for an hour or something, right before I was applying to school. We said, I don't think anybody's going to let me be a doctor, like a physician, an MD, because I don't think a board, even if I finished school, passed the MCATs, passed my certification exams, all that kind of stuff, when I got to the board, I don't think they would let a 9-time felon drug dealer be a physician. So we said, let's put being an MD aside and go for a PhD.
Man, what do you think your hooks were back then? If you had to look back.
So you mentioned one. I grew up essentially without my dad. You already talked about that. So I'd love to hear some of the thoughts that you have from the research you did. I know I have my thoughts. I grew up with my mom and my sister. So I had no male role model. I didn't really know how to be a man. And hopefully that's okay to say in today's setting. Like, I'm a heterosexual man. It was like I had no real model of that.
Yeah.
So I had to kind of create it myself. That's one. That caused a lot of anxiety with girls. A ton of anxiety. And then I'll tell a funny story. I don't think this is in the book either. I was 13 in junior high. Did you have a crush in junior high?
Did I have a crush? Yes.
Okay. I mean, I remember the girl. I remember the name. I remember everything about this crush. This is in the day of actual phones. Nobody had a cell phone, right? I'm 13 years old. Called her house. I had a crush on her for months. I got the courage to call her. Called her house. Her dad, of course, picks up first, right? I got to get to her. We talked for 30 minutes, shoot the shit. And then I asked her out to a movie, and she flatly rejected me. Turns out she had a boyfriend, which was a bad move on my part. But the next day, this is like 7 p.m. Next day at 7 a.m., I show up to school. All her friends know. All the girls in my class knew that I'd asked her out. And for the next 2 weeks, they did what, as a 13-year-old boy, felt like bullying to me. Everywhere I went, they just kept bugging me about this thing. I didn't ask another girl out until I was in my mid-20s.
Wow.
It caused me so much embarrassment. Like, the fear of failure for me around my relationship with women became so huge. So that was a huge hook for me.
Wow.
And drugs help with that, right? Like, if you've got a lot of drugs, especially if you're the one selling the drugs, it's a lot easier. You don't have to kind of figure out how to talk to people. They'll come talk to you.
So would you say fear of rejection then?
Huge fear of rejection, which resulted for me just generally in social anxiety. I don't do it hardly at all now, but that took a lot of work. I used to sit in the middle of conversations like this. While I'm talking to you, I'd be thinking about what you're thinking about me. I'd be thinking about what different people looking at the camera, like, all day, constantly in my head. I don't know if you ever had that ever happen in your head.
I don't have that, but when I do have that, it's when I use like THC.
Cannabis, yeah, no doubt.
Dude, it just does not work with my brain. I'm not like that. Like, that's not who I am. But when I, growing up, if I had smoked weed with my friends, due to peer pressure or whatever, I've never enjoyed it. I've always felt that turned up to 11.
Yeah.
When under the influence of THC.
I used to smoke weed every day, and then one day it turned into that, and I really can't get near it.
Wow.
I can tell you the neuroscience reason why it happened.
Yeah, why?
So there's a lot of people don't know this, but obviously cannabis turns on cannabinoid receptors. Everybody knows that. But it also turns on opioid receptors to some extent, which is why you get some pain relief from cannabis. Well, one of the opiate receptors is a kappa receptor. Kappa receptors, unlike the more typical omega receptors and things like that we talk about, actually activates anxiety and panic. And so what happens with people is a lot of times their kappa receptors get hyperactivated at some point. Yours sound like they were hyperactivated from cannabis early on. And the moment that happens, it's panic and anxiety.
Kappa receptors.
Kappa receptors.
Dude. Yeah, I've never heard that explanation before, and I've always been curious because some people are so high functioning on it.
Totally.
Even though they'll pass the blunt around, and
they go work.
And they go work, or they're like they become even more social, more gregarious, more charming.
Totally.
For me, I'm like, I feel like I'm going crazy.
100%. My wife knows that about me because she kind of likes smoking weed. We had a party once. Do people still want you to test it every once in a while, or do you test it once in a while?
Well, I'll do like a very small dose, but only in the context of like just before bed, because it does in like a microdose, up to like 5 milligrams. It helps actually reduce anxiety. Like if I feel like I'm having trouble turning my brain off from the day. Yeah, it helps in that context, but I have to go to bed. Like I can't.
You're like, I'm out.
Yeah,
you better don't talk to me.
Yeah,
Sophie and I were at a party. And somebody rolled a joint, and it's legal here. So it's like, they just rolled a joint. I took one hit off this thing. I literally sat in the corner at this party for like 20 minutes. I couldn't talk. And eventually I walked up to Sophie, and the only thing I could get out of my mouth was, we have to leave.
Yeah,
we have to go.
It makes it really uncomfortable.
Full dysfunction.
Wow. What's the difference between an addiction and a habit? Because like there are, well, actually, also this is interesting because I didn't realize this, but you have an expertise in nicotine. You did your dissertation on nicotine, so I really enjoy taking nicotine and I'm not endorsing this for anybody. It's a highly addictive substance, but like, and you've got to have a responsible relationship insofar as that's even possible. But I enjoy it, and I'll do it on a fairly consistent basis. I mean, I don't feel like I'm addicted to it. Like I could stop doing it, but I just really enjoy it, so I don't stop.
Yeah. The stopping thing is an interesting caveat that everybody feels like they have to put with habits, as if that's the thing that stops it. Look, by the definition of habit, you'd say you're addicted to water, you're addicted to breathing, you're addicted to walking, you're addicted to sleeping, right? Because there are a lot of things you do habitually. I don't think that's the definition of addiction at all. It's consistent negative outcomes and costs and consequences that interfere with your ability to function normally in life. And then on top of it, you attempting to stop or reduce the behavior that causes those consequences and finding yourself unable. That's addiction, right? So if nicotine, like if the way you use nicotine was found tomorrow, especially with your health and wellness orientation, to cause a specific kind of cancer, given your genetic predisposition, and you really cared about it and you tried to stop and you couldn't, we'd be talking about it as an addiction. If every time you leave the house, if you didn't have your nicotine, you have to run back and you find yourself late to meetings regularly because of your nicotine use, which, by the way, think about smoking cigarettes back in the day, right? People would stop meetings if they were really long and would go out smoke.
Yeah.
So that's part of where the addiction came in. And that's what I mean over and over. Like, we have to pay attention. It's not that the substance is the problem. It's the behaviors around it. And nicotine's a great example. Nicotine's an interesting drug, right? Because it doesn't cause euphoria. It's not a massively powerful subjective effect, right? By subjective effect, I mean like you don't feel completely different like you would from 4 shots of alcohol or like a big line of cocaine or like a high dose of THC. You're altered in a much bigger way. Same with caffeine, but nicotine is unique. It doesn't actually have a direct impact on dopamine, but what it does is it impacts the rate of dopamine release. So it kind of enhances how much dopamine your brain will release for other things. So a lot of people, when they stop doing nicotine after they've done it for a while, they talk about life being dull because it's like the regular activities used to deliver more dopamine for you. Even the earned dopamine was higher because you had nicotine along with it. When the nicotine goes away, you get less of that activation.
That doesn't sound good.
I mean, again, it's like
anhedonia, essentially. Like
if you stop it, you'll get, I like that, the term. Yeah. If you stop, a lot of people will have relative anhedonia for a while.
Wow.
Again, you're talking like 10 days, right? Which in the grand scheme of things is not that big a deal. It's also appetite suppressant, right? A lot of people use it for that. So look, one of the points I actually make in the book is this. I think we've gotten things twisted a little bit. We live in a pretty puritanical country, right? Even though everybody's using porn behind the scenes and adulteries and all-time highs and like, all this crazy ish is happening all over the country, the basis is puritanical. And so I think we get ourselves mixed up sometimes because there's a story that we shouldn't be using substances, we shouldn't be engaged in pleasuring behaviors. There's something wrong with it. It's not godly. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And I think we get ourselves caught between a rock and a hard place because everybody does. So it's kind of hard to have the conversation about, well, hey, you shouldn't take any shortcuts to pleasure. Well, what do you call going to a comedy show? Like what's the positive aspect to your life of going to a comedy show other than elevating your mood? Unless you're a comedian, it's not helping your life, right? It takes money from you. They're making you drink because that's the minimum requirement. Like the reason you do it is because it gives you pleasure. Movies give you pleasure. They're completely useless outside of that, other than like documentaries that teach you something. We love changing our mood based on behaviors and substances. It's just what we do. We've done it forever. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But if you're doing it to cover up things you're unhappy with and you start leaning on that thing, right? Do I know anybody who's addicted to movies? No, but you probably have people who are like binge watch shows ad nauseum at the cost of social interaction, at the cost of their family relationships, right? That could be an addiction because they're addicted to the numbing effect of this constant video stimulation at the cost of engagement in what they need to do.
So true. My one of my brothers for about a two-year span was like addicted to video games. Like
Video games are a great example. Great example. What was his game?
StarCraft.
Okay.
He was like addicted. Like he wouldn't. There's like a great South Park episode about this, like where they're not even like the kids like become addicted to like these games. I think it's like literally StarCraft, possibly in the episode, but it's like they're not even Cartman like won't even get up to go to the bathroom. His mother has to bring him like a bedpan so that he could like shit into the bedpan. He's like so engrossed in the game.
Oh.
And like refuses to get up. But like one of my brothers, I'm not saying he did that, but like he was like almost that addicted for about 2 years. He became overweight. He was like eating all kinds of junk food. He wouldn't leave the screen. It was during his high school like years. So yeah. And he was like a transplant he went to some like weird high school in Florida. It was like just after my parents had gotten divorced. And so he was like, he felt like a bit of an outcast. And he just fell into this like video game addiction, and he quit cold turkey. I mean,
nice.
He's now super into jiu-jitsu, and he's like the fittest, strongest guy I know.
So here's my guess. I know nothing about your brother, and let's see if the model here works, okay? You already gave me a little bit of it, but I know about your parents and your mom and all this stuff. So my guess is your brother found that particular video games, maybe video games in general, especially with all the social aspects of these role-playing games, right? And so in a really difficult period of his life, and he didn't have counseling, he didn't have a lot of the other things that would have helped resolve. I mean, my parents almost got divorced, and it was earth-shattering. You know, you go from mom and dad are going to be together forever, and we're a nuclear family, and this is who I love in my life, and they're all going to be together, to like, wait, dad left? What the hell does that even mean? So he's stuck in this place. It sounds like he even had to move somewhere. So he has none of his friends, he has none of his support structure, and he's alone, and he finds this thing that serves the role. And so he does it. And at first it probably wasn't addictive. It was like just a little bit when he felt bad, but then it kept working. And so every time something brought up how he's isolated, how he has no friend, he would go to this thing. And it became the escape. It became the sole coping strategy almost, right? Nothing else was really needed. And my guess is, and I don't know if this is true or not, but a handful of years after, whatever that was, whatever the intervention was, it could be a new relationship in his life, it could be a job, something else helped fill that gap for him. And when there was something else to go to, and that's the response selection part of Sparrow, now he had a different menu option to choose from to play that same role, to deal with the anxiety. What do you know? Was there anything that happened in his life when he was able to quit? Was there any changing circumstances that helped him?
I think shift? He probably, I'm going to guess he discovered his own, I guess, physicality. And I think maybe at that point discovered like jiu-jitsu, which he's excelled in. Like he's like like almost competitive level.
Love it. So
martial artist.
After this, just ask him, like just offhand, I wonder who introduced him to jiu-jitsu, or like how he found out about it. Because, you know, people talk about addiction like it's something you can't beat. The number of people I know who've been badly addicted to one thing, but then ended up getting in a really good relationship, a really supportive, strong relationship, and all of a sudden the addiction's gone because the partner wouldn't stand it. And I'm not saying this works for everybody. A lot of people listen to this and go, well, but I know somebody who got in a relationship. You got to understand the hooks. If you don't know what the hook is, you have to address the hook. We don't all have the same one. Some people have real massive trauma, right? Like big T, oh my God, trauma. Meeting a good partner may not be enough. Like they may have to do some real trauma-informed somatic work or something like that.
How does your work diverge from more conventional approaches to addiction, like the self-help groups, like the So-and-so Anonymous, all that kind of stuff?
Well, one major way is I don't think you have to demand abstinence as a starting point, which is a big departure. We actually just did a debate about, like, not just my approach, but AA versus other approaches kind of a thing. And, you know, AA requires you to want to stop. A lot of people that are struggling with addiction don't want to stop. So it kind of precludes them from being part of AA or any of the other 12-step groups. But number one, I don't require abstinence. I don't think it's a necessary initial piece. The other piece, and I talk about this in my previous book, I don't think you have to even measure how well you're doing in your recovery from addiction by abstinence, right? So I'll use your brother as an example because we just talked about him. I don't think your brother can never play a video game again in his life. But that's what traditional addiction work would do. They would say, well, you're an addict. You asked me the question before, am I an addict? They would say, well, your brother was addicted, so he's an addict. Well, you don't get to be a non-addict one day. You're an addict for the rest of your life. So he better stay away from video games. It's really, really dangerous for him. I don't think that's true, right? I think once you resolve the issue, then the addiction no longer becomes a problem. The behavior wasn't the original problem. Now, to be fair, because there are people listening right now who are struggling with addiction, you can't just stop for a while and then go back to the behavior hoping that you relieved it. You have to resolve the underlying issues. That's where the magic is. So that's the number one thing. Number two, a lot of traditional recovery is actually really traumatizing for people. And so one of the things we put in here in the book is really a lot about trauma-informed care, because, we know more and more about the relationship. Probably roughly 60% of people who struggle with addiction have had a substantial history of trauma. And I don't know if you've had any. I mean, you had at least one big trauma recently, right?
Yeah.
Like losing a parent, I lost my dad. We were talking about the food example. My dad, a physician, died of cancer, a very aggressive form of cancer in his 50s. He was really young. And I remember being in the hospital and the food on the menu was like cheeseburgers and all. And I was like, this seems wrong. Like something seems wrong with the hospital serving you cheeseburgers while they're giving you like stem cell therapy. Like how is this working out? So that was the first time my belief about food really, really changed, by the way. But, losing a parent is a traumatic experience. Now imagine it happening when you're 7, right? Imagine being sexually assaulted or raped, incest. Imagine being in a car wreck that almost killed you, right? Seeing violence, living in an environment where you see people killed around you or your parents engaging in severe violence. Like those things, I don't know if you've ever read Bessel van der Kolk's The Body Keeps the Score or any other.
No, never read it, but somewhat familiar.
Trauma-informed books. Like that stuff embeds itself in your physicality, in your body. And I talk about how memories are formed in the book so people really understand the impact of trauma. But I think it's fair to say that if you had incest as a young child in your family, on you, that affected you personally, you were sexually assaulted. If you're using cocaine or alcohol, or really any drug, opiates, it's not about the opiates. There's a massive well of suffering and pain. And I can judge you all I want, but all that's doing is ignoring and not allowing me to empathetically connect with the fact that you're suffering. And, again, I'm pretty fortunate. My traumas were minor compared to something like that. But you can't fix somebody like that by just abstaining. Not drinking doesn't help their trauma. You've got to go do deep trauma work. And I think that's a big difference. 12-step, I'm not going to say they don't recognize trauma, but it's not part of the vernacular. It's not part of what they do. It's not part of how they talk about struggles.
Yeah, I mean, we've had, I guess, analogous conversations about people's addiction to ultra-processed foods, which now make up 60% of your average American adult's diet.
I don't doubt that.
Yeah, and but the advice that you often will get from your physician in that 15-minute doctor's visit, is just to eat less of it, right? But if you're trying to, but in the context of like ultra-processed food, addiction, I suppose, like what comes up again and again is that by addressing the behavior without addressing the underlying belief or narrative that you hold about yourself, you're putting the cart before the horse.
You're putting the cart before the horse. We talked about your belief around food and its role, right? It's funny if you look, and I'm not an expert in this, so everything I'm about to say right now is just based on my knowledge of the history of food, right? The idea behind so much of this processed food was we go back to the days where we couldn't preserve food long term. Food would go bad really quickly. I think it's safe to say it's better to not die of starvation in the middle of a trip or, in the middle of the winter because you didn't appropriately preserve foods and then you die of starvation, right? Better than death. But that's not the time we live in now. We've got refrigerators and freezers, and you can take fresh stuff and put it in the freezer. We all have one. You can put it in the freezer and keep it for weeks or months. So we've been sold on the idea that these foods are like technologically advanced, right? Which they were hundreds of years ago. They were technologically advanced. If you were going on a journey at sea, you're not able to create fresh food over there. You better have some preserved foods, right? Salted, etc. nobody told us, and I think this is where the problem lies, is by doing that, everything was cheaper, easier to produce at mass, creating better profit margins, more sustainability, right? Companies could put 4 tons of food on a shelf and just forget about it until it's sold. Then when it emptied, they could put it back out. That's not true with fruits and vegetables, right? And so we just weren't told the whole story. And so we bought into Chef Boyardee or whatever the fuck it is, right? Like, which tasted like ass. Like, you compare that to real, so like, I think we just get sold a story. And I think the same thing happens in mental health, if I'm really, really honest. We get told a story that is comfortable for society. It's easy to think of those people as having addiction issues. But when you realize that if you include behavioral addictions, we're close to 100 million Americans who struggle. There's only 350 million adults, right? Like, almost everybody struggles. Well, how can that can't be abnormal, right? That's like saying that eating processed foods is a problem. Well, it's a problem everybody's having. So it's not a problem that those people have to fix. It's a problem we all have to fix, right? And for me, the same thing is true with mental health. I think the first time Americans realized that mental health was an issue for all of us was COVID. Until everybody dealt with it. During COVID, everybody struggled to some extent. And all of a sudden, Americans started being more comfortable having a conversation about not feeling right. I think before COVID, it's coming back a little bit, but before COVID, Americans were about, pick yourself up by your bootstraps, success no matter what, productivity is the only important thing, right? That was kind of like the ethos of America. And I think that's shifting a little bit.
Yeah. No, 100%. I mean, I think we've had, there's been lots of exposure to, the mental health crisis that we're all feeling at the very least, the wake of, some of us more so than others, but
yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, it's a big problem. What is the EAT model?
So I talked about Sparrow. Sparrow is how you understand where you struggle. And then you ask the question of just understanding is enough. EAT is what you do about it. So EAT stands for explore, accept, transform. And there are a couple of different pieces that I'll talk about in it. We talked about America's ethos of like productivity and perfectionism and doing. My rationale in the book is that we only really learn from failures. And so, if you talk about Sparrow, it's the last thing is outcome, right? So it's when you have a negative outcome that you even think about changing. That's why it's 15 years. Like, you could drink every night of your life, have a couple of drinks, and until you get a DUI or you get blackout or your wife is like, what the hell are you doing? You're drinking so much. Or your husband says, or your partner just says like, you start drinking at lunch? Like, what's going on with that, right? Until something happens that makes you kind of cock your head sideways and go, wait, I don't want that anymore. Until that time, you're probably never going to learn about changing your behavior because nothing happens that rattles you. So outcomes are actually an opportunity to learn. The thing is, again, most of the people I work with, I've worked with thousands of people by now over the last 15 years. And like most people I work with don't see outcomes as opportunities. They see them as failures that need to never be repeated. So what do? I drank too much. I blacked out. Okay, I don't like that. They try to transform by not drinking anymore. They're like, okay, I'm going to stop drinking. That succeeds for a day or 2 or 3. A week passes, something activates them. They feel depressed. They feel anxious. All this stuff that I talked about before comes back. They're like, no, I'm not going to drink. I'm not going to drink. I'm not going to drink. It gets really bad. They drink again. Same outcome or another negative outcome. Now they feel like crap. And that cycle repeats hundreds of times. So most people go outcome, transform, and they try to change. And they get caught in this loop. What I say to people is, look, when you have a negative outcome, when something bad happens in your life, stop. Before you try to change anything, ask why. That's explore. Wait, what the hell just happened? So I know I blacked out last night, but when did that start? And I help them lay out across the Sparrow loop, like, when did it start? What was the trigger? What was the stimulus? What did you think happened? The activation, all that stuff. And now you have this map in front of you. Most people, as I talk about in the book, when you do real exploration about what went on around a negative outcome, you find out some stuff that you really don't like. Some beliefs, some relationships you're in, some truths about yourself that are really unsettling. And so a lot of people, when they find that out, again, they want to jump to transformation right off the bat. To me, that's when acceptance comes in. So the second letter is A, it's acceptance. I think a lot of us try to write off big parts of who we are, of our personality, of how we developed, of our history, our parents, our wives, our husbands, our children, our friends, our culture. We try to write them off and kind of just excise them and then go, well, I just won't do that thing again. Like, let's say if porn, you mentioned porn, you just think, well, I'm hypersexual. I shouldn't really think about sex anymore. I'll just cut that out and I'll never watch porn again. I think we have to come to terms and have acceptance over how we got here and who we are in this moment. And sometimes it takes people a long time to sit in acceptance and just really get to a place where they say, you know what got me to that outcome was me doing the best I knew up until now. Well, I'm learning something different so I can change. And then comes transform. And for me, and that's what I love about the content you put out, and, Huberman or Mel Robbins, or like, there's so much now in the world, there's so much information about new ways to be and behave that you couldn't have gotten 20 years ago. You would have had to go to the library and like study for 6 months. Now, transform can kind of be fun. And what I tell people is once you've explored, you understand what you need to change, you've accepted that you are where you are, transformation is like a scavenger hunt. I can't sleep well. So because I can't sleep well, I drink a lot at night. Okay, well, I'm drinking because I can't sleep. Why can't I sleep? Oh, because I'm really anxious. What am I anxious about? I'm not making enough money, or I'm afraid I'm going to lose my job. Like, right, you work that back and you go, okay, I need a career switch, or I need to feel more confident at work. Now I'm going to go out into the world and I'm going to look at all that's out there for how do I get more confidence at work? How do I increase my performance? How do I ask for a raise? How do I talk to my boss differently? Like, you're not even looking at alcohol. You're trying to figure out how to fix the thing that is not allowing you to sleep so that you have to drink every night. And what I found in my clients is you give them that focus and they're all about it. Because we all want to feel good. I mean, I think that's what happened to you with food in some way. When you saw the relationship, you're like, well, I want to live longer and I want to be as healthy as I can for as long as possible. So now looking for healthier foods and replacing it with healthier foods doesn't look like a bad deal. Like a lot of people would say, well, I want the convenience. I want the fast food. I want to be able to go to a drive-thru. Well, not if it cuts my life short of 10 years, right? Not if I'm going to have cancer when I'm 50. Now I want to find the replacement. So that's transformation. So my whole thing is you go through a loop. You get to an outcome you don't like. You do explore, accept, transform. You figure out where you have to change. And that's one practice loop. And then the rest of your life is that. Every time you get a negative outcome in any area of your life, sit down, figure out what happened, get into acceptance, and figure out how to transform it.
I love that. For somebody listening to this, watching this, who is struggling with an addiction, what's like the first place for them? Like, where do they start?
Yeah. Well, at least one caveat I'm going to give is pick up the book. And for me, the reason is simple. It doesn't have to be this, but start learning. I think, like I've already said, and you gave some examples from your own life, everybody is coming to this moment with limited knowledge of everything you've learned until this point. Pause and go look around you, normally outside of your comfort zone, outside of your friends, outside of your family, things you haven't been exposed to, and start learning about the thing you're struggling with. Get as much information as you can at first. That's that exploration mode that I was talking about. What I've seen in everybody I know is if you look enough, you'll identify information that you weren't aware of before that'll make you understand your problem differently. And then to me, after you've kind of settled in your acceptance and you're ready to take action, the next piece is to go into that quote that I said in the beginning. Your job, now that you understand this is a problem, is to wake up the next morning and say, what can I do today to practice new habits, to practice new behaviors, new ways of thinking, new ways of being, that if I keep doing for the long term, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months from now, will create enough of a change in my life, in my way of seeing the world, in my relationships, that I don't have to be dealing with this problem anymore.
Have you heard any of this, seen any of the research or maybe encountered some of these anecdotes of people that are using these highly popular weight loss drugs like Ozempic?
Yeah.
And seeing totally unexpected reprieves from like alcohol use disorder and things like that?
Yeah, absolutely. It happened about a decade, 15 years ago with something called naltrexone. So something is similar. These drugs block, look, one of the things alcohol breaks down to in your blood is what? Acetaldehyde, but sugar. Eventually it breaks down to sugar. So it's not surprising, right? There are people, I've met people who literally live on alcohol because of the sugar breakdown. There's a problem with that nutritionally where they're getting no vitamins and eventually their brain material starts
Interesting.
suffering.
So you think that by like helping them better manage blood sugar, because these drugs were initially approved as like diabetes drugs.
Yeah. So I think the sugar pathway is one of the pathways. I think the other piece is what I've heard from Ozempic. I've never used it myself, but what I've heard anecdotally about Ozempic is it cuts down on cravings, period. So it makes people not want to engage in a lot of things that feel craving-like. I just want to, I'll say it here for the first time publicly, and let's see if this plays out to be true. The underlying hooks that they're struggling with are still there. Ozempic didn't help them with that. So my guess is they'll move away from the addictions they've had to date, but they'll develop some other coping strategy and ones that could still be unhealthy and unhealthful, as you mentioned, because it's not dealing with the mental health component.
Fascinating. Yeah, I mean, people, there's often high rates of weight regain when people come off of these drugs, unless they've learned the habits and instituted the habits to sustain the weight that they've lost. Once they come off these drugs, like unless you want to be on them for the rest of your life, I mean, it's important to learn about the value of, for example, protein and resistance training and all that stuff.
Huge. And again, like just let's take that example, right? That example you just gave. So people want a shortcut because the outcome they don't like is they've gained too much weight and they want to change. What do they go to? They go to transforming the behavior. And they go, oh, if I take this drug, I'll get to transform the eating behavior. I'm good now. Well, then they get caught in this loop of, well, now I don't want to eat. So you either maintain the drug so you don't want to eat. And by the way, I've already heard that there's people then struggle with what to do. And I've already heard that there's some anecdotal evidence of they used to spend a lot of time worrying about food. Where do you transition that to now, right? There's no training in that. Now, by the way, if people are really responsible about this, and I don't mean just the physicians because they're probably not going to do this, but therapists, psychologists, coaches should probably start coming up with programs to help people that are on Ozempic to go, okay, look, we get this reprieve from your cravings. Now let's get into the real behavioral change that will need to happen. You remember like the band surgeries and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah.
It's not all that different, right? When the band surgeries first made it, you get a band surgery, you would lose 30% of your weight like that because you felt satiated so much faster because your stomach was like a tenth of what it was before. But what would people do? Do you know? People would start pushing it and stretching it. Eventually, they figured out that they could do it with liquids, not solids, because you'll find hacks around it if you really, really want it. And so I think it is great to get some help. If Ozempic helps you reduce the craving so you can get a pause, by all means, but don't get lazy. I'm going to keep stealing I might steal it past this podcast. I'll give you attribution, but don't make the mistake that you can still get away without the earned dopamine. I only let myself, it's kind of funny to even say this out loud, right? Like during COVID, I got way more into my own fitness because all the gyms closed. So I bought weight equipment for the home and I could work out like 7 days a week. I let myself eat more if I did a really hard workout and I earned it. And it's in the same kind of vein of what you're talking about, right? Pleasure is fine. We don't need to avoid, my notion, my sense is that's not a sinful behavior to have pleasure, but it better come because you've earned it. It better come because you feel internally like I did the work to get this thing. That changes not just the relationship you have to dopamine, but also to yourself. It gives you confidence and self-efficacy. You wake up the next day and you feel like I can conquer whatever else I needed to because I did it yesterday.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And you're looking jacked.
Yeah,
lean and jacked right now.
I gained, I don't know, I worked out literally like 7 days a week during COVID. It's all that and music was all I did because we couldn't do anything.
What do you play? You play music?
I play music. That's why I moved to LA at first, one of the reasons.
What instrument?
I play guitar primarily.
Oh, nice.
But then, I don't know if you know anything about digital music. It's like about 10 years ago, it became so easy. Like any laptop can really replace an entire studio nowadays. So during COVID, I built a little home studio for myself. I had a gym in the back. My wife and her friends would sit upstairs, watch the worst reality TV on the face of the planet for hours and hours and hours because there was nothing else to do. And I was downstairs working out and making music.
Man. Well, what excites you about the future of addiction treatment, addiction research? Where do we go from here?
I love that question. AA has been the predominant force for almost 100 years, literally about 90 years. I think that's transitioning. I don't know if I played a role in it, but for the last 10 to 15 years, there's been this voice that we need something else. Number one. Number two, I think, as you mentioned, because of COVID, we're much more comfortable talking about mental health. And I think that's the more important conversation. Really, one of the points that I end up making in the book more than anything else is there is no addicts and normal people. That doesn't exist. That's not a real split. That's like saying there's healthy people and unhealthy people, right? There's no, the line is arbitrary, and it's where we decided to put it now. What does exist is a continuum of a tendency towards addiction and compulsivity. I think our job, hopefully in this move away from, I'm praying, in this move away from, our goal is to be the most productive, most efficient, most effective, biggest powerhouse in the universe kind of a world, to let's take care of each other, let's take care of ourselves, right? Our longevity, our well-being, our joy, our happiness, our contentment with our life is much more important. I feel like the addiction field itself is moving towards trauma-informed care and really taking care of the people who are suffering, because that's, to me, again, for the vast majority of people who struggle with addiction, the underlying component is suffering, not just bad behavior. We focus on the bad behavior for so long, it's time to stop. So I'm really excited about that. A lot of the work that I now do in the world is with ultra successful people. And it's really cool to see how even some of them, whether they're entertainers, executives, authors, like just, it's a smorgasbord, if you will, of people. They're really, really good at so many things, and then they get stuck in this one area of life. I talk about work addiction. That's a real thing, right? People release so much else in their life. They lose relationships, they lose marriages, they stop taking care of their health, all for success. To me, that's also an addiction. So I think we're moving to broaden the definition and start taking care of people and their pain instead of punishing them for the behavior that we don't like.
That makes sense, yeah. So moving away from a model that focuses, I mean, it's like, it's reflective of, I think, the conversation around so many other areas of healthcare today, where it's like we've been for so long hyper-fixated on the symptoms and like the behaviors, essentially ignoring the root cause, you know, the underlying beliefs, narrative, trauma.
Yeah, we were talking about Mark Hyman before, right? Like this notion of, it's even before preventative care. It's like wellness as the antidote to disease instead of symptom relief as the antidote to a disease state, which I think is where we've been for so long. We look for something that went wrong, and then we try to address the thing that went wrong instead of saying, well, why did that happen? And you know, it just, again, we were talking about this before, but even listening to your story, how insane is it? If you just stop and think about it for a second, how insane is it that there's been an entire Western medicine industry created that only looked at something when it broke? Like, what would we do in the rest of our lives if that's where we looked at it, right? Like if you would only take the car to the mechanic when the engine malfunctioned and like you broke in the middle, nothing would work. We have oil change, we have all this other stuff, but in taking care of ourselves, either in our heads or our bodies, we've sort of waited for stuff to break until we fix it. So I think moving away from that is a beautiful thing.
But aren't there still some, like, I mean, obviously addressing the behavior, the underlying, you know, trauma and all that is super important, but aren't there some addictions where there is sort of like a biochemical shackle that needs to be dismantled? You know, like an addiction to like meth, for example. Like, I mean, you could think about the trauma and address that trauma, but I mean, there's like some serious, like, you know, I don't know the bio neurochemistry of it, but
look, I think there's always, just to be clear, I think there's always partially a biochemical component. It's been the overarching part of the conversation for so long that everything else got neglected. There's a study, you may have heard about this if you've ever done a podcast on this, because I feel like this is one people talk about all the time. But during the Vietnam War, there was a rampage in terms of like literally an epidemic of opioid use in Vietnam among veterans, among active military soldiers. And when they came back, the military was worried, the U.S. government was worried that they were going to import back hundreds of thousands of heroin addicted individuals. So they did all the screening back there and tried to get people off of it. When people came back, a very small percentage continued using opiates here. It wasn't as available. The environment completely changed. There were so many other things that shifted when they moved. Now, it wasn't that nobody did, but it was like 10% instead of what they expected, which was 50 to 60%.
Interesting.
We undervalue environment. We undervalue mental health. We undervalue support. We undervalue human factors of relationship. And I think we have to look at that more. opioid addiction, by the way, is one of the big ones, for instance, right? So like once somebody's addicted to opioids, the detox phase is really, really uncomfortable. I mean, severe pain. People describe it as take the worst flu you've ever imagined in your life, multiply it by 10. There are points in the middle where you probably want to die from how painful and uncomfortable it is. And that makes sense, right? What do opiates do? They're pain relievers. So you get really hooked on a pain reliever, right? You use it over and over and over. It numbs your emotional and your physical pain. You take it away, your body is screaming in physical pain. Of course, that's part of the reason why people go back to using. You can address that. Addressing that will not fix the addiction, is my point. So I just, to be clear, I'm glad you brought it up. It's not that you don't need to deal with the biochemical. That is the short-term part of the relief. You can fully relieve that and then do nothing for the hooks, and the person will still probably come back to addiction.
That makes sense. Yeah, you just can't only address that.
Yeah, otherwise dopamine blockers would work for all addictions. You would just block people's dopamine response. Now again, life might not be fun, but if you're addicted to alcohol regularly, you get into accidents, you black out, you do really, really crazy stuff, not having fun in life would probably be a pretty good solution compared to killing yourself and other people. It just doesn't work. Dopamine blockers don't work.
I didn't even know that those were a thing.
Yeah.
Wow. Very interesting. Well, people should definitely go and pick up your book, Unhooked, Free Yourself from Addiction Forever. Super excited, man. It's a big, huge accomplishment.
Thank you so much, man.
Yeah, and such an important work.
I really appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
Of course. One last question for you before we get to that. Where can people buy it? How can they support your work? Where can they find you on social media?
So readunhooked.com is probably the quickest website during pre-sale. I don't know when this is going to come out, but I'd never bought a book on pre-sale before in my life until I published, and then all of a sudden they were like, you need to pre-sale. So that's a whole new thing I discovered. So it's there. I have a website called jaffe.com. You can find it there, but it's available on Amazon, Barnes & Nobles, everywhere else you would buy a book.
Yeah, I guess it's worth stating, like if you're a fan of if you want to support an author's work, there's a lot of value to pre-ordering their book.
Huge.
Yeah.
Did you know that before you started publishing?
No, but I learned that, in due time for my first book to come out, like somebody, tipped me off to that, and it's very valuable. And the reason for that, for people who are not in the publishing world, is that all of your pre-order sales count towards the first week of sales. Yeah. And so it is, if you really want to support an author, which I think we all should, it's quite valuable to pre-order, because you'll never get that kind of momentum, that first week of momentum, ever again. No, because every pre-sale counts towards the first week of sales.
Yeah, so it could be like 6 months of pre-sales. They all count for the first week.
Yeah,
and then also what I didn't even know is like the publisher figures how many books to print based on pre-sale. So if you sold like 50 books, they print a few hundred books or 1,000 books, and they figure that'll get them through the run. If you sell 10,000 books, they'll print like 100,000. So then also the bookstores put more on shelves. It's a whole like everything else in the world. It's a game. Anyway,
yeah, but
I don't know how to play the game.
But it's amazing that it's amazing when you're able to publish a book. I mean, it's a massive accomplishment, and so I wish you all the best. Yeah. The last question that gets asked everybody on the show: what does living a genius life mean to you? I'm going to steal my answer from the work that I did. I did some Brene Brown workshops back in the day, and she has you kind of figure out everything down to 2 values. And for me, it was authenticity and excellence. And so authenticity means to me to just show up as the best version of myself in that moment, whatever that is true, and just being authentic to myself. But excellence to me means that I'm never done trying to make that version better. So learning is a huge part to me. And, it's the word genius in life may kind of connote that anyway, but I'm a firm believer that I'm going to learn for the rest of my life. Literally until I take my last breath, I'm going to keep learning more and more about life. So that's the genius life for me. Amen. Hey, if you liked that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.